Adventure. A bold, usually risky undertaking, hazardous action of uncertain outcome. Or an exciting or unusual experience. But this is aviation, so of course we can't openly say that our flying is bold, risky, or potentially hazardous. So I'll say that ferrying a 70-year-old, super slow, single-engine airplane with limited fuel range all the way to Alaska was simply an exciting or unusual experience. Hello everyone, welcome back to Average Aviator. I'm Travis, and if you're just joining, this is the second half of the adventure that was my first time ferrying an airplane to Alaska. I highly suggest you go watch the first video, which you can find in the link in the description below. But as a quick recap, I had just landed at a small strip located along the Glenallen Highway in British Columbia called Toad River. This stop was a necessary stop on the leg from Fort Nelson to Watson Lake because the PA-12 was dismally slow. With its seaplane propeller and its upgraded engine paired with non-upgraded fuel tanks, it meant that a few trips across the road with the Airframe Alaska liquid containment bags was the only way to assure that we wouldn't run out of fuel on the final approach into Watson Lake. After fueling up and checking the weather, we took off into some of the most beautiful scenery that I have ever flown through. Now, when I say check the weather, you're probably thinking, oh yeah, just go on, pull up all the TAFs for the area, maybe even move the little slider thing to see if there's any trends of weather moving in the area that you're interested in. Check the radar, see if there's any storms that are popping up, where they are, where they're moving to, how much of the area they're covering, all that good stuff. But in northern British Columbia and the Yukon, that does not work because there is zero radar coverage and the only TAF along the route of flight was the TAF at the destination. So I could tell that there was a general forecast for convective activity in the area, but I had zero SA on where the storms were, how bad they were, how much of the area was covered, and where along the route they were, or anything like that. So really, taking off, it was kind of a crapshoot, but what else could you do? That was the only information available, and if you wait for a perfectly clear day, you'd probably be waiting like 3 weeks or so. Like I said, adventure. So we weaved our way through the mountain valleys, following the highway past a place called Muncho Lake, which was just a beautiful turquoise blue. But, of course, as we rounded the corner of the valley by Muncho Lake, we could see that up ahead there were small storms and rain showers brewing about. As we progressed to Watson Lake, it turned into dodging storms and finding the least menacing-looking rain to fly through. At one point, flying through a benign-looking rainstorm, small hail pellets started planking off the glass, but thankfully the hail didn't last very long. Thankfully, the weather held out and didn't deteriorate that bad. We were able to pick our way through all the way to Watson Lake. We arrived at Watson Lake to find a line of aircraft waiting for fuel. They were also headed to Alaska, and for short-range aircraft like that helicopter and the Cub, this specific route up the highway is basically the only way to do it. After fueling up and checking the weather, we realized it was going to be more storm dodging and rain shower hopping all the way to Whitehorse. But we took off from Watson Lake behind the Cub and were delighted to find that our slow PA-12 was somehow faster than another airplane. We joked about this over the radio with the Cub driver as we slowly passed him, which then sparked an all-out race to Whitehorse. It was on. Unfortunately, the leg to Whitehorse was still out of range for the PA-11 to go nonstop, so we landed at an airport called Teslin to dump in another liquid containment bag in the tanks. Because there were more storms predicted around Whitehorse, and the fuel range was still questionable, I made the decision to go fill the liquid containers from the gas station down the road. Unfortunately, Teslin didn't have any transportation available, so we stretched our legs on the 2-mile walk into town. We filled up the liquid containers and were dreading the prospect of carrying that fuel all the way back 2 miles uphill to the airplane. Thankfully, a local offered to give the bags a ride to the airport on the back of his quad. He could have just taken off with the fuel, and there's absolutely nothing we could have done about it. But thankfully, after running the 2 miles back, we found the bags were dropped off neatly right next to the airplane. Thank you, Mr. Random Yukon Man. As we were running back to the airplane, the yellow Cub came in to land at Teslin. With his lesser fuel burn, all he had to do was dump in some fuel from a tank secured in the front seat, and off he went. We quickly topped off the PA-12 with fuel and were off racing the Cub once again. We spent the better part of an hour dodging more storms and admiring the scenery until we got close enough to listen to the current weather at Whitehorse. A storm had parked itself over the mountain directly east of the airport and was pushing out downdrafts that turned into winds 18 gusting 20-something flowing directly across the north-south runway. We arrived to Whitehorse airspace at the exact same time as the Cub, and honestly, it was just luck that we were sequenced for landing first. But sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and with double the horsepower, we won that race just barely. Unfortunately, to actually win that race, we still had to land, and that was definitely going to be a challenge. Another thing to keep in mind is that I had relatively low tailwheel time at this point. I mean, maybe 100, 150 hours, and I definitely had never faced this kind of crosswind with this kind of airplane before. Like I said, adventure. The only saving grace was that the runway was huge for the PA-12, as it was normally used by airliners. I chose to go full speed down final to get a feel for the winds and fly the wheels onto the ground first. The higher speed meant that the wind would have a slightly diminished effect, but more importantly, the flight controls would be much more effective. I rocketed down final at about 100 miles an hour, and, well, now that I say that, that actually doesn't sound like rocketing. That's pretty slow. But for the PA-12, that was rocketing down final at 100 miles an hour, and then smoothly reduced the power as I carefully felt for the runway with one wheel. Riding the wheelie, I slowly flew the other main wheel onto the pavement once it was ready. At this point, the owner started saying something like, "Nice job," but I knew the fight was far from over. I simply replied, "Not done yet," as I continued fighting with all the flight controls to keep the wind from blowing the airplane all the way around. Eventually, I wrangled the airplane onto the taxiway, and even the controller noted how challenging it was, remarking, "That looked sporty," as he switched me to the ground frequency. We taxied to park, shut down, and crawled out, just as Willie Coon and the cub he was ferrying taxied to park next to us. We shared a laugh between us as he pulled in, both of us knowing that challenging landings like that are just how it goes when you're a ferry pilot, and we were both glad that we had navigated that challenging landing safely. Adventure. Although we were on the ground, the ordeal was far from over. Construction had closed the normal GA parking/tie-down area, so us, the Cub, and the R-44 helicopter all had to find makeshift parking on the open ramp. The helicopter was fine, but with small storms popping up all around Whitehorse, the two light tail draggers had to improvise some tie-downs. With no tie-down rings in the concrete, I walked over to the edge of the pavement and found some rather large rocks. I grabbed the biggest rocks I could carry and trucked them the 50 yards over to the airplane. We slapped some tie-down ropes on them and gave the ropes a good tug to ensure that they were holding. I don't think I'd trust this setup in a hurricane, but these makeshift Yukon tie-downs were good enough. A friend I had previously met on the trip with the Mooney out to Idaho graciously let us borrow a car for the evening, which was an absolute lifesaver as the 100 low-lead fuel pump was out of service. We had to make several trips to the gas station to load up on fuel, so without the car, I don't know if it would have been possible. I have to give a special thanks to Sarah and Kyle for the help. It was much appreciated. The next day, the weather was IFR in the morning, but it was forecast to clear out. Unfortunately, it was not clearing out nearly as fast as was predicted. I don't remember exactly what the weather was calling that day, but I do remember that we made the decision to launch out of Whitehorse with less than ideal weather because we were confident that we were headed to better conditions. I will say that part of our decision to launch in less than ideal conditions was predicated on a pressure that I have to talk about now. One of the main challenges of making the trek to Alaska is the crossing back into the United States. There are no places to stay or fuel stops between Whitehorse and the airport of entry into the United States, Northway, Alaska. While this 250 nautical mile stretch wouldn't be that much of a challenge alone, U.S. Border Patrol added a huge obstacle by only allowing aircraft to make the crossing at two specific times, 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. This means that if you landed in Northway anytime after 10, you had to wait 4 hours until the border agents came back at 2. If you missed them at 2, you had to wait until 10 the next day. When you take into consideration that Northway is an abandoned airport with no services and that you're expected to stay in or near the aircraft until you've cleared customs, you can imagine what kind of get-there-itis pressure this Border Patrol schedule puts on pilots. Apparently, the locals at Whitehorse had seen some aviators take off in nasty conditions trying to make the border entry time. Thankfully, we were able to have enough time to depart in not ideal, but decent enough conditions and have enough time to make the second crossing. I will also note that it appears Northway Border Patrol has since changed their policy to where you can schedule a crossing at any time between 10 and 2, but at that time, the pressure to make the 2 p.m. crossing on the dot was very real. In any case, the dreary rain started clearing out as we navigated the valley northward. But eventually there were clear skies and the R-44 that took off well after us passed us like we were standing still as we reached one of my favorite parts of the Alcan route, Kluane National Park. As you reach the park, the valley opens up with a crystal clear lake with some of the tallest mountains in North America and some glaciers off to the west. But even though the scenery was absolutely beautiful, we were of course fighting some major headwinds the entire way, so I landed in Burwash to throw in the rest of the fuel in the tanks. After throwing in the fuel, our next stop was Beaver Creek, the last stop in Canada before crossing back into Alaska. We made it into Beaver Creek with a little time to spare, so a local couple gave us a ride into town so I could throw an extra 5 gallons in the tank for good measure. I thought Beaver Creek was an interesting little airport, but soon we had to depart for a very important border crossing time. We crossed into Alaska and landed at Northway. We were in the United States once again. After a short wait and a quick search for nuclear material with a Geiger counter, which was set off by the magnetic compass oddly enough, we were clear of customs and were off on our way once again. On the quick flight up to Toke for fuel, I spotted my first moose of the trip. I found it cool how relatively easy it was to spot the mooses, meese. Easy it was to spot the meese when they were in the water. They looked big even from all the way up there. Filling up in Toke, we saw what was probably the coolest bush plane I've ever seen. This just monster of a Super Cub, painted completely black. After a quick bite to eat at the truck stop across the road, we were on our way south, heading toward Anchorage, but the rain was not quite done with us yet. Thankfully, our route cleared up completely, and the valley we found ourselves in was just absolutely gorgeous. I know I keep saying this, but I feel like I had never flown in terrain like this before. I know that all the mountains probably look very similar on camera, but as I progressed along this trip, the difference in mountains was just absolutely stunning, and every single part of it was all different. As we progressed further south, the mountains just kept on getting bigger and bigger, and every time it just blew my mind. There's some of the biggest mountains in North America in that area. We made a final fuel stop in Glenallen, and as we checked the weather, we realized that there was going to be one more pretty big hurdle that we would have to overcome in order to get the airplane finally delivered. The reporting stations heading into Anchorage were all calling marginal VFR due to smoke, dropping the visibility to 5 to 6 miles in most places, but all the way down to 3 miles in some places. Though that visibility isn't ideal, it's still VFR, so we fueled up for the last time and decided to make the final push for the last leg of the trip. About an hour down the valley, we came across what would become one of my favorite Alaskan airports called Sheep Mountain. Nestled on the side of a mountain, presumably inhabited by an abnormally high number of sheep, this 2,300-foot narrow gravel strip looked like a great place to get out and admire the scenery and reflect upon how far we had already come. The wind sweeping up the valley dropped out right below the tree line, which made my landing at Sheep Mountain not the best, but it was good enough. Thankfully, the right brake waited until this exact moment to fail on me, making it difficult to turn the airplane uphill against the winds, but I eventually got it sorted out and we parked the airplane and got out. Then, a Cessna 140 came in and their landing at Sheep Mountain made me feel a little bit better about my landing, so that was nice. We took a small break to stretch our legs and just took in the beautiful scenery all around us. Alaska truly is an amazing place. But the gawking at the scenery eventually had to come to an end, so we were off once again. The takeoff at Sheep Mountain was probably the lightest the PA-12 had been at any point in the trip, and boy did it feel like a rocket ship. This is in stark contrast to the stock PA-12s that are typically known as dogs in the climb, but that seaplane prop, man, this thing could rip. But as we progressed down the Glenallen Highway, the smoke started getting thicker and thicker, and soon the mountains seemed to be popping out of the haze at alarming rates. Now, to be fair, nowadays, 3-mile visibility and smoke following a highway would be no sweat to me, as I now have a good bit of experience dealing with smoke, but at the time, I had no such experience, and it seemed like the mountains were just jumping out of the smoke at me everywhere. At the time, I was concerned about hidden mountains just popping out of the smoke, so I tried to find a way out and realized that there would be no mountains in the river. I realized that though the highway went up and down with the terrain that I was having a hard time seeing, the river was a constant descent to the ocean with no mountains in the middle of it. I conversed with the owner in the back seat about the option of diving into the river valley to avoid the Smoky Mountains. After a search of the sectional revealed that there were no depicted wires or power lines, we both decided that dropping into the river valley was really not a bad option. Also, the owner, being from Alaska, knew, and the sectional verified, that this part of the river was uninhabited, meaning that I could adhere to FAR Part 91-119 without a doubt. Okay, I have to take a quick second to go over this regulation because I know there's going to be people that don't understand and people that come after me in the comments, so let's just get into it. 14 CFR 91-119 is the minimum safe altitude regulation, and it governs the lowest altitude that an aircraft can be operated at. It states that anywhere you can't fly so low that if you lose your engine, you can't make an emergency landing without hitting people or property on the surface. It also says that over congested areas, such as a town or settlement, you have to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet of the aircraft. But over other than congested areas, you have to be at an altitude of 500 feet above the surface. But there's a caveat to that because it says over open water or sparsely populated areas, aircraft just can't be operated closer than 500 feet to any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. And if this part of Alaska isn't considered sparsely populated area, I don't know what is. To limit risk where I could, I gave the owner the job of reading the map in the back while I was completely eyes outside looking for any hazards that may come up while we were flying low. I will say that running down the river with mountains looming in the distance through the smoke was a surreal experience. As we soared gracefully a few feet over the gravel bars, I reflected about all the challenges I had to navigate to get to this point, and how there were so many unknowns and so many firsts that were involved with this trip. I had learned so much and overcame so many new challenges, and it was a great feeling. And then we nearly crashed. As we progressed down the river, I noticed that up ahead the valley narrowed considerably and there were several small houses along the bank. Realizing the visibility had cleared up and not wanting to get near the houses, I started a shallow climb near mile 77 of the Glenallen Highway, Chicaloon, Alaska. As I flew overhead at 1,000 feet, I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was mere minutes and one decision away from death. Not 4 months later, in this exact spot, one pilot was not so lucky to make the decision to climb.
A plane crash near Chicaloon turned deadly after a pilot and his aircraft crashed into the raging waters of the Matanuska River. It happened around 1 o'clock Thursday near mile 77 of the Glen Highway. Lex Yelverton brings us the story.
The National Transportation Safety Board says 2 pilots were flying 2 separate planes in the valley Thursday when one clipped a cable that crossed the Matanuska River from a waterfront property. One pilot is presumed to have landed safely before reporting the incident, but the other wasn't as fortunate.
Initial investigation indicated that the aircraft was flying low level over the river and collided with a cable pulley that was strung across the river from a platform to a property on the other side.
I will admit, I love flying low as much as the next guy, but maybe let the poor soul who ended up in the river in a split second at least be not in complete vain, and make sure to do a thorough recon for obstacles before going and flying low, and please don't fly low in unfamiliar territory. While I would like to say that after I heard of the accident, I put the flying low in unfamiliar terrain behind me, but I went on to push my luck at least once more after that, and thankfully it did end up working out, but that's a story for another day. Aviation is in this weird place where we are constantly fighting a hopeless battle for a 100% safety record in an environment that requires some acceptance of inherent risk even for the most normal of operations. No matter how much we try to mitigate risks, our human fallibility ensures that we will make mistakes, and often we have no idea we are even making them. The desire to learn from others' mistakes is also very strong, so we pick apart everyone's mistakes and we try to be better and safer for it. However, we've come so far in aviation so quickly that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we have access to a privilege our ancestors merely dreamed about. And this would absolutely not be possible without pioneers pushing the boundaries and taking risk. Don't get me wrong, I am in no way suggesting that I'm a pioneer because I flew a small airplane to Alaska, but I believe that pioneer spirit is something that should be considered valuable when assessing risk. So go out and tackle some challenges, increase your crosswind limit, train up to land at shorter fields, launch on that long cross country to somewhere you've never been. Finding that balance between risk and safety is where you gain invaluable experience. Risk management is something that is impossible to fully learn, and I'm definitely still working on it myself. Sometimes you just get lucky. I know that even though I wasn't perfect and made plenty of mistakes on this first run up to Alaska, it grew me more than I could have ever imagined, and I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. And I did do it again. 4 more times that year, in fact. And each one of those trips to Alaska were a bold, usually risky undertaking, hazardous action of uncertain outcome. Well, actually, it's aviation, so maybe they are just an exciting or very unusual experience. Adventure. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more ferry flying adventures. Until then, see ya.